graders, we are going to continue our read aloud of A Tangle of Knots. We just ended with chapter 9, and after chapter 9, we're going to jump in time to 1 week later. There's also another recipe, V's Mystery Fudge Cake. We're going to learn about V in this coming chapter. Make sure that you're looking at the recipes that are in the doc so that if you want to try them out with your family, you can. And if you do, send a picture to your teacher so we can see your creation. Okay, so chapter 10. Katie. Katie had only ever dreamed that this day would come, the 7th and final day of her trial period with a new family. But here she was, 1 week in with Toby, and everything was going swimmingly. Well, maybe not swimmingly, but fine. Far from grand, but not horrible either. Truth be told, Toby didn't talk much. Reserved, Miss Mallory would have called him, like a table at a fancy restaurant where only a select few could sit and chat. And that made it difficult to get to know him, to figure out what might make their new little family go from fine to magnificent. But Katie had a secret weapon. That very morning, while Toby was off on his airport run, Katie had baked him a yellow cake with chocolate frosting. She wasn't entirely sure if it was Toby's perfect cake, but it was worth a try. She could smell it now, sweet and luscious and minutes from ready as she searched for wildflowers beneath the Emporium's cracked porch slats. The good news was that Miss Mallory had not yet come to retrieve Katie from her new home, as she'd done with all of Katie's previous family trials. And if Katie could hang on just a few more hours, then that very night at the 53rd Sunshine Bakers of America annual cake bake-off, Miss Mallory would officially declare whether or not Katie and Toby were a perfect match for each other. Whether Katie could finally have her own adoption day party and bake her own cake. It was a big day indeed, and not just because it was the first time Katie had ever managed to use both of her guest tickets for the bake-off. Katie tried to soothe the ache she felt in her chest, dull and worrying, whenever she thought too hard about leaving Miss Mallory in the orphanage for good. A worrying ache seemed a small price to pay for a perfect family. As Katie plucked a yellow dandelion from a mess of weeds outside the Emporium's front door, Mrs. Asher's dusty red hatchback pulled to a stop in the driveway, the only car there besides the owner's. Katie raced to greet her. "Hello there, sweetie," Mrs. Asher said, tucking the red whatever it was that she'd been knitting under one arm. She gave Katie a quick hug and hurried to the other side of the door of the car to open the passenger's door. "Katie, this is V." Katie took a long look at the woman sitting in the passenger seat, staring through the windshield at the Emporium. She was a mystery fudge cake, Katie was sure of it. A circular chocolate cake with a gooey chocolate center hidden inside it. "She doesn't talk. Take this bag, will you?" "Thanks. Do you need help getting her settled?" Katie asked, taking the bag of groceries Mrs. Asher handed her. "I think we'll be okay," Mrs. Asher said. "You wouldn't happen to know where my children are, would you?" Marigold's practicing oboe. Katie flicked an elbow toward an upstairs window, from which faint, stilted notes of music had been puttering for the last several minutes. "But I don't know about Zane and Will. We met them, remember?" "Well, at least I can count on one of my children to do what she's supposed to." Mrs. Asher tugged the duffel bag out of the back seat. "You haven't seen my hairpin by any chance?" "Your hairpin?" Katie asked, finally realizing what it was about Mrs. Asher that seemed so different this morning. With her brown curls strewn wildly about her face, instead of tightly up in the bun the way they'd been all week, Mrs. Asher somehow looked a decade older. Although perhaps Katie thought that had more to do with the whole moving to a lost luggage store with 3 children while her husband found a summer job in New Jersey to pay for the repairs to their apartment from a rogue hot air balloon attack situation. "I haven't seen it," Katie told her. "Sorry. I've never misplaced the thing. Not once in 11 years. But I guess with all the commotion this week I must have." She sniffed the air. "Are you baking a cake?" Katie nodded. "It smells delicious. Marigold loved the one you made her, you know." Katie smiled. She'd baked Marigold a lime pound cake the day the Ashers had moved in last week, and the girls had been fast friends ever since. In the passenger seat, Vi finally seemed to snap out of her trance. She held the duffel bag while Mrs. Asher helped her with the seatbelt. "What kind of cake are you making today?" Mrs. Asher asked. Katie shifted the groceries to her hip and twirled the small bunch of yellow wildflowers in her left hand, watching the petals spin in dizzy circles. They were nothing like the dazzling purple petunias and multicolored pansies Miss Mallory cared for at the home for lost girls. But they made Katie ache just the slightest for the place all the same. She looked up at Mrs. Asher. Did you know you're a honey cake, she said, rich with dark sweetness and a surprising kick of spices. Mrs. Asher helped V to her feet. That is just remarkable, she said, shaking her head. You're right, that does sound like exactly the perfect cake. Katie looked down at her feet. I'll have to make it for you sometime. She felt the warm hand on her shoulder before she saw it. Sweetheart, Mrs. Asher said, everything okay? Katie bit her bottom lip. I just want Toby to be happy with me is all. What if the reason he was so reserved was that Katie wasn't the daughter he'd always dreamed of? What if, tonight at the bake-off, he told Miss Mallory to go ahead and take Katie back? Mrs. Asher opened her mouth to reply, but just at that moment, the wordless woman, V, made a noise like a startled horse. She dropped her duffel bag right in the dirt, and when Katie looked up, she saw that the woman was staring at her. What's that about? V bolted for the Emporium door. Oh, train. Train. Okay. V bolted for the Emporium door. Oh dear, Mrs. Asher said, rescuing the duffel. Her gaze followed V to the door. Whop, pop, went the wood against the frame. She's had a difficult week, she told Katie. Katie nodded. Before I forget, Mrs. Asher hoisted the duffel to her shoulder and drew the red whatever it might be from underneath her arm. With quick fingers, she worked the needless needles through the yarn, finishing off the last row of loops. Then snipped the loose end with a pair of scissors she pulled from who knew where. She traded the object to Katie for the bag of groceries. This is for you. It was a knitted red apron, perfect for cake baking. Katie ran her fingers over the naughty red flowers stitched to it. That must be her talent, right? It was the first piece of clothing that anyone had ever made her. Thank you, she said. Mrs. Asher squeezed her hand. Of course, and Katie looked up from her apron. All a parent really wants from his child is her happiness. So if you're happy, Toby will be too. Katie was bending down to pick a particularly beautiful wildflower when she saw the plume of dirt curling down Argyle Road. At the far end of the drive, Katie could just make out a man on a bicycle, kicking up more and more dust as he headed even closer. Did I skip a page? No. Okay. The man was huge, towering, even on a bicycle, although he rode it well. He was wearing a gray suit, and no matter how hard Katie squinted, she couldn't determine the man's age. He might have been 40, he might have been older. There was a single powder blue suitcase, there's that suitcase again, strapped to the back of his bicycle. A suitcase? St. Anthony's suitcase? The man rode right up to the front door. He swung a leg easily over the center bar of his bike and leaned the contraption against a dying hedge. Good morning, he greeted Katie, unhooking the suitcase from the back. Morning, Katie replied. The man bent down and picked up the flowers Katie hadn't realized she dropped. He handed them to her, a sideways sort of grin on his face. It was a grin that suggested he knew more about the world than he was letting on. From the bottom of his suit jacket, she could make out several bits of knotted rope. Thanks, Katie said, taking the flowers. Remember that first prologue with the knots? Taking the flowers. It's a funny thing, fate, with a capital F. Katie looked up from her flowers. There's no controlling what fate hands you, the man went on, pulling the suitcase to his side. It was a very old suitcase, boxy and large as a small child, with worn corners and 3 small dimples near the left clasp. And in my experience, it rarely seems to give you exactly what you need at the exact moment that you need it. Katie wrinkled her eyebrows. Sir, she said. Maybe he thought she was someone else. Just remember this, he said. It's the way we deal with what fate hands us that defines who we are. Sure, Katie said, turning her attention back to her wildflowers. Maybe she'd find some more blossoms in the backyard. I'll keep that in mind. But when she looked up again, the man in the gray suit was no longer there. That was a great chapter. So, what are we thinking about the prologue in connection to chapter 10? What are we thinking about knots and the quote from the prologue? What are we thinking about Katie and Toby and how they're adjusting to each other? What do we think about the silent lady V and her reaction when she saw Katie? She ran away. Was it in reaction to Katie, or did she see something else? Interesting, right? So there's a lot to think about here, and a lot of connection making. I hope you all enjoyed that. Have a great rest of your day.